I want to start by saying that I didn't ask for any of this. That's important, because when people hear the story now, and they do hear it, everyone hears it, it showed up on 3 different galactic news feeds, and somebody made a documentary about it that I haven't watched because I'm told they got my voice completely wrong. They assume I went into it with some kind of agenda. Some grand plan. Some deep inner humanity is amazing conviction burning in my chest. I didn't. I just needed the overtime pay. That's the honest answer. That's the real beginning of everything. My name is Dara Osai. I'm a grade 7 mechanical systems engineer, or I was, in February of 2387 when all of this happened. I'm technically grade 9 now, which tells you something about how the story ends, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In February of 2387, I was 31 years old, living in a 2-room apartment on Callisto Station, eating prepackaged ramen 4 nights a week, and carrying about 42,000 credits of student loan debt from the Advanced Propulsion Engineering program I'd finished 6 years earlier, and never quite managed to pay off because entry-level coalition mechanics don't make what the brochures imply they make. So when my supervisor, Chief Marvella Huang, called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon and said, "Osai, I need someone for the Varanthos deployment, 8-week rotation, combat tier hazard pay, interested?" I said yes before she finished the sentence. She looked at me for a second. "You know it's a Drethari vessel, right?" I said yes again. She looked at me a second longer. "You've worked with Drethari before." I had not. I told her this honestly. She exhaled slowly, the way Marvella does when she's deciding whether to be straightforward or diplomatic, and then she said, "The Drethari are particular about their engineering spaces. Their systems are." "I'll figure it out," I said. And that was that. I signed the deployment papers that evening, packed my kit bag the next morning, and reported to Docking Bay 14 at 600 hours on a Saturday, carrying a thermos of coffee and the particular kind of nervous excitement that comes from knowing you've made a decision you can't take back. The GCS Varanthos was enormous. I need you to understand that before anything else, because it matters for what comes later, the scale of it. The way it just sat there in the docking bay like something carved from the darkness between stars, too large to fit comfortably in human imagination. It was a Drethari Conquest-class vessel, which sounds aggressive in translation but actually refers to a specific hull geometry, long, tapered, almost bone-like in structure, with flanking arrays of sensor fins that the Drethari use the way humans use eyes. Where a human warship looks like something built, something assembled from deliberate engineering decisions, the Varanthos looked grown, like something that had emerged from a process older than manufacture. It was beautiful in a way that made you slightly uncomfortable. I stood there at the bay entrance with my kit bag on my shoulder and my thermos in my hand, and I stared at it for a long moment. Around me, the docking bay hummed with the usual loading chaos. Freight drones moving supply pallets, coalition logistics officers running manifests on data pads, a cluster of human marines in full combat kit, joking in that loud, performative way that military people joke when they're nervous. A few Ivalan technicians in their silver environmental suits, their bioluminescent skin flickering through what I'd learned meant mild anxiety. And at the top of the boarding ramp, standing perfectly still in a way that no human ever stands perfectly still, was a Drethari. The first one I'd ever seen in person, not on a screen. They're tall, you probably know this. 7 feet is the average. Their bone structure is exposed along the outer arms and shoulders, natural exoskeletal plating that looks like it should be armor, but is actually just how they're built. Their skin is deep gray-green, almost matte in direct light, and their eyes are compound in the outer ring with a focused central lens that gives them a look of terrifying precision even when they're doing nothing more threatening than standing at a ramp. This one was wearing an engineer's sash, deep blue, meaning senior grade, and carrying a data pad in one of its mid-hands. It was watching the loading process with that unnervingly still attention the Drethari have, cataloging everything, missing nothing. I took a breath. I walked up the ramp. The Drethari looked at me. Not down at me exactly because they're too composed for something as emotionally legible as looking down at someone. Just at me, with that compound and focused gaze. "Osai Dara," I said. "Grade 7 mechanical systems, reporting for the maintenance deployment." A pause, the Drethari's mid-hand moved, tapping something on the data pad. Then it said in translation-filtered standard that came out smooth but with a slight mathematical undercurrent, "You are the replacement for Engineer Voss." That's right. Another pause, the kind of pause that from a human would tell you they were deciding something. From a Drethari, you couldn't be sure. "You are aware this vessel operates under Drethari protocol standards." Chief Huang briefed me. Did she brief you adequately? It wasn't phrased as a question, technically. The translation unit doesn't really capture the particular Drethari grammatical register that makes it something between a question and a statement and a mild challenge. I learned that later. At the time, I just said, "I believe so." The Drethari looked at me for another moment. Then it moved aside from the ramp entrance and said, "I am Vethriken Solith, Senior Engineering Officer, GCS Varanthos. You will be under my supervision." "Understood," I said. And I walked aboard. The inside of the Varanthos was even more disorienting than the outside. Drethari vessels are built around a concept they call Vethara. It translates roughly as functional harmony, the idea that a ship's interior should feel like a living system, not a constructed one, which means the corridors aren't straight. They curve. Not randomly, there's logic to it. The geometry follows the load-bearing stress patterns of the hull, so every curve makes structural sense. But to human eyes walking through it for the first time, it felt like being inside something that had been designed by someone who considered straight lines a failure of imagination. The lighting was bioreactive. Drethari prefer slightly lower blue-spectrum illumination, so the corridors had this deep, slightly blue-shifted glow that made everything look like being underwater. The temperature was about 3 degrees cooler than Coalition standard. The air had a faint mineral undertone that I later learned was the Drethari equivalent of mood-neutral air filtration. And the ambient sound, this is hard to explain. There was always a low, subsonic hum, like the ship itself was breathing, that Coalition vessels don't have. I later found out it was deliberate. Drethari find total silence deeply uncomfortable in enclosed spaces, so the ship's environmental systems generate a continuous baseline vibration that translates, for them, to a kind of acoustic reassurance. For me, for the first 2 days, it just felt like being on a vessel that was perpetually about to shake itself apart. I followed Vethriken Solith down 3 levels and through 2 curved corridors to what passed for the ship's administrative hub. A hexagonal room with mapping displays around 4 of the 6 walls, and a command table in the center with a surface that looked like liquid metal, and was, in fact, a highly advanced haptic interface. There were 4 other crew members in the hub. 2 more Drethari, I later learned their names were Okrath Veldin and Seth Varenmoro, respectively the navigation officer and the environmental systems lead. 1 Ivalan in the silver suit, identified as Lyseth Communications, and 1 other human. His name was Sergeant Breck Colton, Coalition Marines, and he looked at me when I came in with the expression of a man who has been the only human on an alien warship for 3 days, and is very glad to see another one. "Engineer," he said. "Sergeant," I said. We shook hands. There was a slightly desperate quality to the handshake, like 2 people clinging to a shared life raft. Vethriken Solith placed my deployment papers on the command table with a precise, economical gesture. "Your service quarters assignment will be processed before evening cycle," it said. "Until then, Engineer Osai, I suggest you review the Varanthos propulsion manifest. We depart in 18 hours. I expect you to be familiar with all primary and secondary drive systems before we enter transit." I looked at the manifest it pulled up on the display beside me. It was 47 pages long. "Of course," I said. Vethric looked at me for a moment. Then something happened, a very subtle shift in the way it held its head, a slight compression of those compound eye rings. It would take me weeks to learn that this particular expression meant something between skeptical and I will wait to form a judgment, and that from Vethric specifically, it was practically affectionate. At the time, I just read it as neutral. "The propulsion systems on Conquest-class vessels are not standard Coalition equipment," it said. "You may find the learning curve significant." "I tend to learn fast under pressure," I said. Another of those pauses. "We will see," said Vethriken Solith. The cabin assignment came through 4 hours later. I was sitting in what I'd found to be the closest thing the Varanthos had to a common room. A small hexagonal space one deck below the hub with a materials replicator, a table, and 3 chairs designed for Drethari proportions that I had to sit on sideways, reading through the propulsion manifest on my datapad, and slowly becoming aware that Drethari drive engineering was going to make everything I'd learned in the advanced propulsion program look like basic arithmetic. Sergeant Colton sat across from me, which is to say he sat sideways on his own oversized chair, and was doing something on his personal comm unit that he didn't volunteer information about. My housing assignment came through as a ping on my official datapad, a brief note in the formal terse language of Drethari ship administration that read, "Due to vessel reconfiguration in sectors 4 and 5, ongoing maintenance of original crew quarters, standard single occupancy allocation is not available for newly assigned personnel during current deployment period. Arrangements have been made for shared occupancy with consent of relevant parties. Assigned quarters, Deck 3, Corridor Veth 7, Chamber 14. Shared assignment, Vethriken Solith, Senior Engineering Officer." I read it twice. Then I found Sergeant Colton looking at me with an expression that suggested he'd already received some version of this information. "Yeah," he said, "the ship's in partial refit. Half the crew quarters in sectors 4 and 5 are stripped down to the hull frame." "I'm sharing a cabin with the Senior Engineering Officer," I said. "Technically, you're sharing their cabin. It's their quarters. They're being asked to accommodate you." He paused. "I'm told they agreed." I thought about Vethriken Solith standing at the ramp, that stillness, those compound eyes. "Great," I said. "Could be worse," Colton said. "How?" He thought about it. "You could be sharing with Okrath Veldin." I tried to have a conversation with him yesterday about navigation routing, and he stared at me for so long I thought he'd gone into some kind of trance state. I looked at my datapad, then back at the propulsion manifest, then at the cabin assignment again. I finished reading the manifest, or tried to. I got through 31 of the 47 pages before the evening cycle chime sounded. A deep, resonant tone, nothing like the buzzer on coalition vessels, more like a bell that had been tuned to the ship's own resonant frequency. And I gathered my kit bag and went to find Corridor Veth 7. Deck 3 on a Drethari vessel smells like cold metal and something faintly organic that I never quite identified, not unpleasant, just distinctly non-human. The corridors down there were narrower than on the upper decks, curving more tightly. The bioreactive lighting dimmed further toward that deep blue-indigo range that made everything look like the bottom of a very clear ocean. Chamber 14 was about halfway down Corridor Veth 7. The door was Drethari standard, a smooth, sensor-activated panel that reads biosignature before opening, keyed now to both Vethric's signature and mine. I put my hand to it and it opened, and I stepped inside. The room was larger than I expected. Drethari engineers at senior grade get substantial quarters. This one was roughly 12 feet across by 20 deep, with the ceiling vaulting upward to about 10 feet at the center, which is the Drethari equivalent of feeling spacious. The walls were bare composite, the deep gray-green that Drethari architecture defaults to, with strips of that blue-shifted lighting along the upper joins. There was a sleeping platform on the right side. Drethari beds are firmer and wider than human ones, built for their exoskeletal structure. And on the left, a workspace. A long desk with haptic surfaces, storage units above it, and a secondary display panel that currently showed schematics I recognized as the Varanthos' drive core. In the far corner, there was a folded structure that I realized, after a moment, was an improvised second sleeping arrangement. A coalition standard cot, collapsed, with a basic pillow and thermal sheet sitting on top of it. They'd gotten a cot for me. I stood there for a second, just registering that. Whoever had arranged this, Vethric, the ship administration, someone, had thought to source a human standard cot rather than leaving me to sleep on the floor or improvise something from cargo padding. It was a small thing, but it was the first time since stepping aboard that something had happened that felt like someone had thought about what I might need. I set my kit bag down. I was unfolding the cot when the door opened, and Vethriken Solith came in. We looked at each other. "Engineer Osai," it said. "Engineer Vethric," I said. A pause, not hostile, just the specific silence of two very different creatures trying to figure out what comes next. "I trust the cot is adequate," Vethric said. "It's fine," I said. Thank you for arranging it. It was a logistical requirement, Vethric said, which from a Drethari is practically effusive accommodation. It crossed the room to the workspace, setting down its datapad with that economic precision, and began reviewing the drive schematics without further conversation. I finished setting up the cot. I put my personal items in the small storage area I'd been allocated, a shelf unit that the ship's admin had placed against the left wall, clearly new, still showing the faint marks of recent installation. I arranged my toolkit case under the cot. I set up my own datapad on the edge of the workspace, being careful to maintain clear distance from Vethric's area. Then I sat on the cot and opened the propulsion manifest to page 32. Vethric worked at the desk. I read on the cot. The ship systems hummed their constant low vibration. That was our first night. The Varanthos entered transit the next morning. Drethari FTL is called Veth Crossing. It uses a different principle than Coalition fold drives, something to do with the way they model dimensional pressure gradients, and the experience of transit is genuinely different from anything I'd been through on Coalition vessels. On a Coalition ship, FTL entry is sharp. There's a compression sensation, a brief visual distortion, and then you're in the smooth, slightly eerie non-space of a fold tunnel. Clean, almost clinical. On the Varanthos, it felt like the ship leaned. That's the only way I can describe it. Like something enormous just tilting very slightly sideways, and then finding a different kind of balance. No compression, no visual distortion. Just this gentle, profound wrongness in the inner ear that lasted about 4 seconds, and then resolved into something that felt almost like being in deeper water, the ambient pressure marginally higher, the sound of the ship's hum shifting half a tone lower. I was in the propulsion bay when it happened, standing next to a drive regulator the size of a small building, and I grabbed the nearest railing because my body told me the floor was tilting, even though the floor wasn't tilting. Vethric was standing 12 feet away, at the primary monitoring station, and looked at me with that compound focus gaze. You experienced disorientation, it said. Not a question, statement. Briefly, I said, is that normal for humans in Veth Crossing? The vestibular system of most soft-bodied species registers the dimensional shift differently than Drethari skeletal structure, Vethric said. The effect diminishes with repeated exposure. Good to know, I said. Are you functional? Yes, I said, and let go of the railing and stood straight and looked at the drive regulator. And I think looking back, that was the first moment. Not a big one, not a dramatic one, just Vethric asked if I was functional, not in a warm way, in the way you'd ask if a piece of equipment had successfully completed a startup sequence. But it asked, it checked. And when I said yes, it turned back to the monitoring station and said, the tertiary resonance array will need calibration within the first transit hour. I will walk you through the procedure. And we got to work. Here's the thing about Drethari engineering that nobody tells you in the briefing documents. They don't explain things the way humans explain things. Human engineering pedagogy, even in technical training environments, even at grade 7 level, has a foundational logic to it. You start with principles, you explain the why, and then you demonstrate the how. Even when someone's in a rush, even when they're impatient, they tend to work in that order because that's how human cognition builds mechanical understanding. Principle, reason, application. Drethari engineering instruction, at least the way Vethric practiced it, worked from the opposite direction. Application first. The what before the why, here is the procedure. Execute the procedure. Observe the system response. Now tell me why the system responded the way it did. This was, for the first 2 days, genuinely maddening. Vethric would show me a calibration sequence, sometimes just once, and then step back and watch while I attempted to replicate it. And when I made a mistake, which I did several times because Drethari haptic interfaces are designed for a hand configuration that's different from human hands, and the muscle memory transfer is not intuitive, it wouldn't tell me what I'd done wrong immediately. It would say something like, consider the resonance variable in step 4 and wait. The first time this happened, I stood there for a solid 30 seconds before I figured out what I'd miscalibrated, and the entire time Vethric stood behind me in that absolute stillness, watching, and I could feel the watching. Not maliciously, just the way you can feel being closely observed by something with very good eyes. Got it, I said when I'd found the error. Correct the variable, Vethric said. I corrected it. The system response shifted into the green band it was supposed to be in. Why did that work? Vethric said. I explained it. I'd figured it out partly from doing it and partly from what I'd read in the manifest. The resonance variable in step 4 relates to the dimensional pressure reading in the Veth crossing gradient. And if it's set wrong, the tertiary array tries to compensate for a pressure imbalance that doesn't exist, which overloads the secondary coolant cycle. Vethric was quiet for a moment. Adequate, it said. That was the closest thing to praise I got for the first week. The shared cabin, after 3 days, had developed into something like a routine. Vethric kept the workspace from roughly 600 to 2200 ship time, which was a long day even by Drethari standards, and I later found out that Vethric's work hours were considered excessive even among its own crew. I matched the schedule as closely as I could, partly because the work genuinely needed it, and partly because I was still deep in the learning curve of Drethari drive systems and felt like I couldn't afford to fall behind. We developed an unspoken division of the workspace. Vethric's haptic stations were the left 3/4 of the desk surface. My datapad and the portable diagnostic unit I'd brought in my kit occupied the right quarter. We didn't discuss this. It just happened, the way shared spaces always develop their silent jurisdictions. In the evenings, the last hour or so before lights out, Vethric would switch from active system work to what I slowly came to understand was review. Pulling up records, cross-referencing data, running quiet simulations on the secondary display. It did this in total silence. I would usually be on the cot reading or running my own diagnostics, or once I'd started getting familiar enough with the Varanthos systems to have opinions about them, writing detailed notes in my personal log about what I was observing and thinking. On the 4th night, I asked a question I'd been sitting on for 2 days. The resonance dampeners in the secondary drive column, I said. The ones on the starboard side of the tertiary array. Vethric didn't look up from the display. What of them? They're running about 4% below optimal calibration. Has been consistent since we entered transit. A pause, Vethric's mid-hand stopped moving on the haptic surface. You observed this. Yesterday morning, during the 800 check. I logged it. I saw the log. I wasn't sure if it was within acceptable parameters, or if it needed a flag. Vethric turned from the display. Not fully, partial turn, the way Drethari move when they want to give attention without committing the full gesture of it. 4% below optimal in a tertiary resonance dampener during active Veth crossing is within the upper tolerance of acceptable variation, it said. However, it warrants monitoring. If it reaches 6%, it requires immediate correction. Understood, I said, then. What causes the drift? Is it something in the transit gradient, or is it a hardware issue? A longer pause this time. Vethric turned the rest of the way. It was looking at me in a way that felt different from the usual evaluative scrutiny, less like checking equipment, more like something else I didn't have a word for yet. That question, it said, is one that most new technical staff on Drethari vessels do not think to ask for at least 3 rotations. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a statement of fact or some third Drethari thing I didn't have a category for. Is it a useful question? I asked. Yes, said Vethric, and then it pulled up a new schematic on the secondary display, one I hadn't seen yet, and said, "Come here." I got off the cot and came to the desk. And for the next 40 minutes, Vethric walked me through the mechanics of dimensional pressure drift and its interaction with tertiary dampener calibration in a way that was different from anything before. Less procedure first, more like thinking out loud, the way an engineer does when they're talking to another engineer they're fairly sure will follow them, using the why before the how. I don't know if Vethric knew it had shifted registers. I suspect it did. Day 6. The incident that changes things, in almost every story, there's one. The moment where the routine cracks open and something underneath gets seen. In ours, it happened at 3:40 hours on the 6th day of transit, when I was woken by an alarm. Not a loud alarm. A Drethari alert tone is more of a deep, harmonically complex chord than the sharp klaxon coalition vessels use. It's designed to wake you from sleep without spiking adrenaline, which is apparently a considered design choice based on Drethari medical research showing that adrenaline-driven emergency response leads to more errors than calm-driven emergency response. I'd been briefed on this. I'd intellectually appreciated it. In practice, the sound went off at 3:40, and I came awake with my heart going and my hand reaching for a tool kit before I'd consciously processed what was happening. Vethric was already at the desk, already looking at displays, moving with that fluid engineered speed that the Drethari have when a situation requires it. The stillness was gone, replaced by something that looked like water moving fast. "Drive column 4, it said, not turning, apparently aware that I was awake. "Pressure variance in the Veth gradient interface, not critical yet." I was on my feet and pulling on my work suit before it finished. "What do you need?" "Physical access to the interface coupling, Deck 5, Section 9. The diagnostic system is reading an anomalous resonance pattern that may indicate a hairline fracture in the secondary coupling housing." "I can get there faster than you can," I said, not a boast, just mechanical fact, because Deck 5, Section 9 was a tight access corridor that required passing through 2 service hatches that were human-wide, not Drethari-wide, and Vethric couldn't get in there. A fraction of a pause. "Yes," it said. "Tell me what I'm looking for." It told me, precisely, efficiently, technical language with no hedging. I had my portable diagnostic unit in my hand, and I was through the cabin door before the briefing finished, finishing sentences in my head as I ran. The service corridors on Deck 5 of a Drethari vessel are not built for comfort. Their maintenance access passages cramped, unlit except for the faint bioreactive glow of the walls themselves, running through the structural skeleton of the ship like veins. For a Drethari, they're too narrow to navigate at speed. For a human who's 5'10" and not particularly claustrophobic, they're tight but manageable. I was through the first service hatch in under 2 minutes. The second took me a little longer because the locking mechanism was Drethari configured, and I was learning, still, how to work Drethari hardware under pressure. But I got through it, and I was in the Section 9 corridor with my diagnostic unit active and the drive column interface ahead of me. A dense cluster of coupling housings, each about the size of a forearm, running along the ceiling and both walls in a formation that looked chaotic, but was actually precisely arranged according to load-bearing logic I was starting to be able to read. Vethric was in my earpiece. We'd established comm contact while I was running. "Looking at the coupling cluster now," I said. "Secondary housings right side." "Third from the far end," it said. "The diagnostic should show elevated resonance on that unit specifically." I swept the diagnostic unit across the cluster. The reading on the third from far housing lit up amber, elevated but not red yet, which meant we had time but not lots of time. "Got it," I said. "Resonance reading is consistent with early-stage housing stress. I can see weight." I moved the unit to the base of the housing. There was something there that the diagnostic hadn't flagged because it wasn't in the resonance frequency the system was monitoring, a discoloration in the composite material at the junction between the housing base and the drive column wall. Hairline fine, easy to miss. "There's a microfracture at the base junction," I said. "Not in the housing itself, in the mounting point." A pause on the comm. "That is not where I expected it to be," Vethric said, and there was something different in its voice, not alarm, but a very specific kind of focused attention that I was learning to read as the Drethari equivalent of this matters. "The resonance stress is coming from below, not from the coupling itself," I said, running the diagnostic over the drive column surface below the mounting point. I think there's a micro-vibration in the column wall that's been transferring stress upward into the mounting. It's not a material failure in the housing. It's a frequency mismatch between the column wall's resonance pattern and the mounting bracket." "You're certain?" "I'm reading it right now. The vibration pattern is consistent. It's cycling at about 12 Hz differential from the column's baseline. If you can adjust the column's operational frequency by..." I did the calculation in my head, which I will say I was proud of, even in the middle of everything. "About 8 Hz upward, you should bring it within resonant harmony with the mounting bracket and stop the stress transfer." A longer pause. "That adjustment is possible from the primary monitoring station," Vethric said. "It is not a standard correction. It requires manual input override." "Can you do it from there?" Yes, hold position. I held position. The drive column hummed beside me. The diagnostic unit kept reading. The amber reading was steady, not climbing, not yet. 40 seconds, I counted. Then the vibration in the column wall, which I could feel through my fingertips on the diagnostic unit, that faint 12 hertz irregularity, changed. Smoothed. Settled. The amber reading on the third housing dropped. Yellow, then green. Resonance pattern normalizing, I said. Confirmed, said Vethric. Then, after a moment, the microfracture at the mounting junction will need physical repair. I can do that from here. I've got bonding compound in the kit. The fracture is small enough for a field patch. We can schedule a full structural inspection when we exit transit. Agreed, and then in a tone that was quiet, more quiet than usual. Your identification of the frequency mismatch was not the expected diagnostic conclusion. I got lucky, I said, which was half true. The discoloration at the base caught my eye. I wouldn't have looked for it otherwise. You looked, Vethric said. Most technicians in that situation would have focused only on what the diagnostic flagged. I didn't say anything to that. I was already applying the bonding compound. But I registered it. I registered it because from Vethric Solith, you looked was the equivalent of a standing ovation. I won't pretend it was all smooth from that point forward. Because it wasn't. The Varanthos was 9 days into transit when the incident with the crew common space happened. And I need to tell you about this because it matters for what comes later. It matters for understanding what Vethric and I actually were to each other, not the clean version where two people from different species just naturally connect, but the real version where it was hard and uncomfortable, and we both got it wrong sometimes. The ship had a common space, Deck 2, a wider hexagonal room, and this one was meant to serve the whole crew's social function. In Drethari culture, the common space is a place for what they call Veth Gathering, a specific kind of group activity where crew members share information, problems, solutions in a semi-structured communal format. It's not casual socializing in the human sense. It's more like a scheduled professional communion. It happens every 3 ship days. Sergeant Colton and I had been attending these gatherings because we'd been told it was expected. The format was alien to us, in a way I'm not sure I can fully convey. The Drethari crew would stand in a loose formation, and each member would offer something, an observation about the ship's systems, a problem they'd been thinking about, a solution to something that hadn't been a problem yet. Information for its own sake, the sharing of attention and thought as a social bond. On day 9, it was my turn to contribute, and I made a mistake. I talked about a structural improvement I'd been thinking about for the secondary coupling brackets, a modification to the bracket geometry that would distribute resonance stress more evenly across the mounting points. I'd worked it out in my personal time, run the numbers, was fairly confident it was sound. I explained it in the human way. Here's the problem I identified, here's the principle behind the solution, here's the proposed modification. The room went still in a way that was different from the usual Drethari stillness. I realized about halfway through that I'd done something wrong. The quality of attention in the room had shifted. But I couldn't identify how or why, so I finished, and then stood there in the particular discomfort of having clearly made a social error in a culture you're still learning. Vethric, at the end of my explanation, said, "The analysis is correct." Brief, final, moving on. Afterward in the corridor, Colton caught up with me and said quietly, "I think you stepped on something." "I know," I said. "I don't know what." He shook his head. He didn't know either. That evening in the cabin, I sat on the cot and didn't bring it up for almost 2 hours. Vethric worked at the desk. The ship hummed, and then finally I said, "Can I ask you something?" Vethric's mid-hand paused on the haptic surface. "Yes." "The Veth Gathering today, I said something wrong." A pause. Vethric turned, the partial turn, attention without full commitment. "You proposed a modification to a system that falls under my engineering authority," it said. "In Veth Gathering, this is the equivalent of challenging the authority of the officer responsible for that system in a public forum." I absorbed this. I didn't mean it as a challenge. I was sharing an idea. In human communication. In Drethari communication, a public proposal to modify a system is a public statement that the system's current design is insufficient, which reflects on the engineer responsible for it. I sat with that for a moment, I should have brought it to you privately first. Yes. I'm sorry, I said. I genuinely didn't know. Vethric was quiet for a moment. Then it said, I am aware that you didn't know. The analysis itself was sound. The bracket modification is worth consideration. Another pause. I will review it. It turned back to the desk. I looked at the back of its head. The exoskeletal plating along the back of its skull, the structural ridges that ran down the neck and into the shoulder architecture. Thank you for explaining it to me, I said, instead of just being angry. A very long pause this time. I considered, Vethric said slowly, not explaining it. Why didn't you? Because the error would have continued, it said, and that serves neither of us. I nodded. Fair enough. Also, Vethric said, and there was something in the register of its voice that I was just starting, to be able to read as something like dry humor. Your bracket geometry calculation contained an error in the load distribution variable that I would prefer to correct before it circulates as a formal proposal. I stared at the back of its head. Which variable? The secondary stress coefficient. You used the Drethari standard material constant rather than the composite alloy constant specific to this hull class. I ran the numbers in my head, fast, and yes, I had. That would have thrown the whole distribution calculation off, I said, slightly horrified. Yes, said Vethric. By approximately 12%. I would have proposed a bracket modification that was 12% wrong, I said. Yes. I exhaled. Thank you for not letting me do that. I said I would review it, Vethric said. I reviewed it. And it went back to work. The next 3 days were different after that. I can't point to exactly what changed. It was subtle. But in the propulsion bay, Vethric started explaining things slightly differently. Less pure application first, more mixed, still leading with procedure, but pausing occasionally to offer the underlying principle without being asked. And when I asked questions, the pause before answering got shorter. On the 12th day, I came back to the cabin from a secondary systems check to find that Vethric had moved its data pad slightly to the left on the desk, creating a larger clear area on the right side, where my workspace was. It was maybe 3 inches of additional space. Vethric was at the display panel across the room and didn't mention it. I didn't mention it either. I sat down at my expanded workspace and pulled up my diagnostic files and spent an hour working in the quiet company of a Drethari engineer who had wordlessly made a little more room for me. Part 4, the crisis. The crisis, when it came fast. We were 16 days into transit. Standard Veth crossing to the deployment zone took 22 days, so we were past the midpoint, when the alarm wasn't the gentle, harmonious chord of a routine alert, but something different. Something I hadn't heard before. A lower, longer tone, almost like a note of regret, repeated twice. I was in the propulsion bay when it started. Vethric was at the primary monitoring station. I saw it move to the haptic surface in that fast water way, and I crossed the bay to the secondary station without being told. What is it? I said. The Veth gradient is destabilizing, Vethric said, and its voice had gone flat, not emotionless but concentrated, the way a focused beam is different from scattered light. In Sector 7 of the crossing path, we are encountering an uncharted dimensional pressure anomaly. How bad? If the gradient instability exceeds threshold before we can correct, we will be ejected from the Veth crossing path. A pause. Non-standard exit at transit speed causes structural damage to the hull at multiple points. Based on current trajectory and the anomaly's observed expansion, we have approximately 19 minutes before threshold. I looked at the readings on my secondary station. The numbers were doing things I didn't like. What do we need to do? We need to recalibrate the dimensional interface array to compensate for the anomalous gradient pressure, Vethric said, hands already moving. Full array recalibration requires simultaneous input from the primary monitoring station and the 3 physical relay nodes in the propulsion bay. 3 nodes, I said. Where? Vethric pointed without looking. The 3 relay nodes were at the far left, center, and far right of the propulsion bay's rear wall, each one a complex manual interface requiring precise sequential input. The standard procedure for full recalibration required 3 Drethari engineers working simultaneously, 1 at each node. We had two people, both at the monitoring stations. I can get to the nodes, I said. Tell me the sequence. There is a difficulty, Vethric said. The recalibration sequence for this anomaly type requires Drethari sensory calibration. The nodes read dimensional pressure through a vibration sensing mechanism that Drethari exoskeletal structure can detect through direct contact. I looked at the nodes, then I looked at my hands. Walk me through what you're trying to read, I said. The nodes produce a vibration pattern under anomaly conditions. The recalibration input depends on reading the specific frequency of that vibration and entering the corresponding counterfrequency. The frequencies are not standard. They vary depending on the specific anomaly gradient. You cannot pre-calculate them. Can I use diagnostic equipment to read the frequency? A pause. The standard diagnostic unit does not have sufficient sensitivity in the relevant. It stopped. Then, your diagnostic unit. The portable one. Yes. What is its vibration sensitivity range? I pulled it out, read off the specs. Vethric was quiet for a fraction of a second, Drethari processing speed being what it is. A fraction of a second is a lot of calculation. Then, it may be sufficient. The sensitivity is at the lower boundary of what is required, but it may be sufficient. Then tell me how to read it, I said, and tell me the input sequence. There is not time to fully explain. Then start talking while I run to the first node, I said. I'll ask questions on the way. I crossed the propulsion bay at a run, which is something you're technically not supposed to do in an active propulsion environment, but the gradient was destabilizing at a rate I could see on the secondary station's last readout, and 19 minutes was going to 19 minutes. Vethric's voice in my ear, we'd switched to comm the second I started moving, was giving me the input sequence in real time. I was listening and running and processing simultaneously in the way that engineers do in emergencies, where training and adrenaline and necessity stack on top of each other, and you find out what you actually know. The first node was a column of haptic interfaces, shoulder height, with a vibration-sensing membrane at the center. I pressed the diagnostic unit against the membrane. The reading came up. I looked at it. The vibration frequency was reading in the lower range, just where Vethric had said it might, and the unit was picking it up barely with enough resolution to distinguish the pattern. I've got a reading, I said. 47.3 Hertz with a variance of about plus or minus 1.5. Vethric was calculating. I could hear, and this was new, this is something I'd never been close enough to a Drethari doing intensive calculation to hear before, a very slight change in the rhythm of its breathing. Not panic, just the sound of a very large mind moving very fast. Counterfrequency input is 61.8, it said. The haptic sequence for that input is... And it gave me a 6-step sequence, which I repeated back while my hands were already moving. The node interface was calibrated for Drethari hand geometry. My hands are smaller, fingers differently proportioned, and the muscle memory I'd spent 2 weeks building for Drethari haptic interfaces was running hard right now. I completed the sequence. I felt the node resonate differently under my hands when I hit the last step, a shift in the physical vibration of the column itself. Node 1 responding, I said. Confirmed on my display, Vethric said. 14 minutes remaining, node 2. I ran. The middle section of this I am going to compress, because if I told you every second it would take an hour, and also because some of it, the specific technical details of the recalibration sequence, involves Drethari proprietary engineering information that I'm not authorized to share publicly. But the broad shape of it was this. 14 minutes of running between the 3 nodes, diagnostic unit reading frequencies, Vethric calculating counterfrequencies in real time, my hands executing sequences on interfaces they hadn't been designed for. I made 2 errors. The first one I caught myself. I input a step in the sequence at node 2 with the wrong pressure, which the haptic interface read as a different value, and the node didn't respond the way it should have, and I said, "Wait, that wasn't right," and Vethric said, "No, repeat step 3." And I repeated step 3, and it corrected. The second error I didn't catch. Vethric caught it from the monitoring station. It saw the output from node 3's first attempt come up wrong and said, before I could even register it, "The variance reading on your diagnostic is drifting." Add point 7 to your frequency reading and recalculate. I added point 7, recalculated, ran the sequence again. Node 3 responded. All 3 nodes holding counterfrequency, Vethric said. Gradient stabilization initiating. I was leaning against the 3rd node column with both hands braced against it, the diagnostic unit still pressed to the membrane, and I was breathing hard. The propulsion bay around me was vibrating at a frequency I could feel in my sternum, not the comfortable background hum of normal transit, but something more urgent, more alive, the ship straining against the anomaly. And then slowly, that vibration changed. Not gone, but different. The frantic quality left it. The sound of the ship's systems shifted, settling like something that had been clenched very tight, slowly releasing. Gradient pressure returning to tolerance, Vethric said. Then, after a moment, threshold was not exceeded. We remain in the crossing path. I exhaled. I didn't move for a moment. I just stood there with my hands on a Drethari relay node in the propulsion bay of an alien warship and breathed, and the ship breathed around me. And somewhere above me in the bridge sections, the Drethari crew was doing whatever Drethari do when a crisis resolves. Osai, Vethric said in my ear. Yeah, I said. The anomaly is past. You can return to the monitoring station. Give me a second, I said. A pause, yes, Vethric said. I gave myself a second. And then I straightened up, and I walked back across the propulsion bay, and I sat down at the secondary monitoring station, and I looked at the readings, which were all in the green or close enough to matter, and I said, what would have happened if the gradient exceeded threshold? Hull breach at multiple structural weak points, Vethric said. Loss of the propulsion array, crew survival probability in an uncontrolled transit exit at that velocity would have been, a Drethari pause, the kind that means precise calculation, 17%. I looked at the green readings on my display. Okay, I said. You performed the recalibration correctly, Vethric said. Under conditions it was not designed to accommodate. We both did, I said. The longest pause Vethric had given me since I came aboard. Yasvet said, we did. The last week of transit was different. I don't know another way to say it. Something between us had shifted in the propulsion bay during the anomaly, not dramatically, not in a way you could point to in a single moment, because it wasn't one moment. It was everything that came before the moment, and then the moment itself, and then the quiet that came after. The way things shift after you've shared a crisis with someone. Not just that you survived it together, that you handled it together. That you were both running as fast as you could, from your very different directions toward the same thing, and you met in the middle. The cabin became something different after that. Still quiet. Still 2 very different beings with very different biology and very different ways of processing the world. Vethric still worked at the desk in that concentrated Drethari focus, barely moving for hours. I still read on the cot, or ran diagnostics, or wrote in my personal log. The mineral-cool air of the ship's environmental system still carried that faint, unidentifiable organic undertone. The lights were still too blue. But the quality of the quiet changed. There's a difference, and I didn't have language for this at the time. It took me a long time to find it, between silence that means absence and silence that means presence. The first week, the silence in that cabin was absence. 2 strangers occupying the same space, parallel, untouching. After the anomaly, the silence was something else. Presence. The awareness of another mind working nearby, not as a background noise to be filtered out, but as something felt and acknowledged. On the 18th day, Vethric did something that I don't think it had ever done in a professional context with a coalition crew member. It asked me a question that wasn't about the ship. We were in the propulsion bay during the midday systems check, a routine task, each of us working through our respective items on the maintenance list. And out of nowhere, not looking up from the coupling array it was checking, Vethric said, "You mentioned, in your personal log entry on day 9, that you had studied at the Advanced Propulsion Engineering program on Earth." I stopped what I was doing. You can access my personal log. The ship's monitoring system makes crew personal communications available to senior officers for security purposes, Vethric said. I am required to review them. There was something in its voice, a very slight, very controlled quality, that told me it was aware this was a sensitive disclosure. that it had chosen to disclose it rather than continue reading my private log without my knowing. That's, I considered, my response. I understand the security requirement. Thank you for telling me. You mentioned debt from the program, Vethric said. You mentioned it in the context of explaining why you accepted this deployment. I looked at the coupling housing I'd been checking. Yeah, I said, student loans. It's a human thing. You pay for education, and then you spend years paying back what you borrowed to pay for it. A pause. You carry financial obligation from acquiring the knowledge that qualifies you to work, Vethric said. That's one way to put it. That is structurally unusual, Vethric said. Not judgment, genuine processing. In Drethari culture, the acquisition of technical knowledge is considered a civic contribution. The collective benefits from each engineer's knowledge. The collective funds the engineer's education. We have some programs like that, I said. Not enough of them, and not for the specific programs I wanted. I paused. The Advanced Propulsion program is expensive because it's rare. There aren't many people who can teach it. Especially not for alien drive systems. You chose it despite the cost, Vethric said. Yeah. Why? I thought about this. Not because I didn't know the answer, I did. But because I was still getting used to the idea of Vethric asking questions that weren't about the ship. Because drive systems are the most interesting problem I can think of, I said. The way you move something through space, or through the dimensional layers, the way Drethari engineering does it, it's the cleanest problem there is. Everything else is about destination. Drive systems are about how you get there. The physics of motion, I've been interested in it since I was a kid. Vethric was quiet for a moment. I find, it said slowly, that this is a more satisfying answer than I expected. What did you expect? A financial motivation, it said. Or a status motivation, the two most common reasons coalition personnel select high-difficulty specializations. Those were factors, I said, but not the main one. No, Vethric said. I can hear that they were not. We went back to the maintenance check. But something had opened, some door that had been present but closed since I came aboard had shifted on its hinge. On the 19th night, I couldn't sleep. This wasn't unusual. The ship's environmental baseline was close enough to human optimal that I'd been sleeping reasonably well. But the slight blue shift in the light spectrum affected my circadian rhythms in a way I'd been managing with small adjustments to my sleep schedule. Sometimes it still caught up with me. I lay on the cot in the dim light. The room's bioreactive system reduced the illumination during the sleep cycle, dimming everything to a barely there blue glow, and stared at the ceiling's vault and thought about resonance frequencies and coupling brackets and a Drethari engineer who had told me, in the dry, precise register that was as close as it got to warmth, that my analysis was more satisfying than expected. After about an hour, I heard Vethric's voice, quiet. From the sleeping platform. You are not sleeping, it said. No, I said, sorry if I'm. You are not disturbing me, it said. Drethari sleep is not identical to human sleep. I was in a rest state, not unconscious. Oh, I said, a pause. Then, because the dark and the lateness of the hour have always made me more honest than is strictly wise, can I ask you something? Yes. How did you end up in engineering? Like, was it chosen for you, or did you choose it? A long quiet, the ship hummed. The light was deep blue, the color of very deep water. In Drethari society, Vethric said, cognitive profiling in early development identifies aptitude clusters. Engineering aptitude was identified in me at the equivalent of your age 7. But identification is not assignment. A pause. I had a choice. Many individuals with engineering profiles choose administrative paths or academic roles within the Drethari Collective's research centers. But you chose a ship. I chose a ship, Vethric confirmed, because this will perhaps sound strange to you. Try me. Because I wish to understand systems under pressure, it said. A drive system in a laboratory can be calibrated to optimal conditions. A drive system on a vessel in transit operates in a continuously varying external environment. The problem is always different. The engineer must be. It seemed to be searching for the precise word which from Vethric was noticeable. Adaptive, it said finally. An engineering solution that works only in one set of conditions is not a solution. It is a preference. I thought about that. I said something like that once, I said. In my application to the Advanced Propulsion Program, I said something about how the interesting part of propulsion engineering wasn't the theory, it was the application in real conditions. I know, Vethric said. I realized it had read that too, in my log or somewhere. The committee admitted me on the strength of that answer, I said, or so my advisor told me later. They were correct too, Vethric said. I stared at the ceiling. Vethric, I said. Yes. This deployment, was it supposed to be a solo assignment for you? Before the cabin situation, I mean before I was assigned here. A pause. Yes. Do you prefer working alone? The longest pause yet. Not hesitation, Drethari don't hesitate the way humans do, but the particular Drethari rhythm that means genuine internal consideration. I preferred it before this deployment, it said. I didn't say anything. I find, Vethric said carefully, that the experience of working alongside an engineer who asks the correct questions has a value I did not anticipate. What counts as the correct questions? I asked. The questions that assume the system is still being understood, it said, rather than the questions that assume the system is already known. I lay in the dim blue dark and thought about that. Thank you, I said. It is not a compliment, Vethric said, and there was that thing in its voice again, that dry, precise, slightly different register. It is an observation. I know, I said. Thank you anyway. The ship hummed. After a while, I slipped. We exited the Veth crossing on the 22nd day, right on schedule. The exit was as strange as the entry, that profound, gentle sense of the ship leaning back into conventional space, the ambient sound shifting back up half a tone, the slight release of pressure that I'd learned to read as the dimensional gradient releasing the hull. Through the porthole in the monitoring room, a narrow slit of real viewport, Drethari ships not being built for the scenic view, I watched normal space come back. Stars in their fixed patterns, the distant smear of the deployment zone's primary star, and around us the scattered presences of the other coalition and Drethari vessels that made up the joint patrol group we were joining. The deployment zone was a region called the Seaveth Margin, a stretch of space near the border between coalition-mapped territory and the contested zone, where 3 different interstellar powers had overlapping claims. The Varanthos' assignment was patrol support, using its Drethari sensor arrays to monitor movement in the disputed sectors, while coalition diplomatic teams worked on the boundary negotiations. For me, as the mechanical systems engineer, the Seaveth Margin meant normal operational conditions in a real deployment environment, which meant the systems I'd spent 22 days learning in transit now needed to work under genuine pressure, not calibration exercises. And they did. Because of what Vethric had taught me, and what I'd figured out by asking questions, and what the anomaly had forced me to understand when theory became survival. The drive systems ran clean. The coupling array stayed in calibration. I caught a developing pressure imbalance in the secondary gradient interface on day 3 of the deployment, and fixed it in 40 minutes before it needed to be logged as an incident. Vethric reviewed my repair log that evening. Correct diagnosis, it said. I know, I said. It looked at me, that compound focus gaze, the one I'd spent 22 days learning to read. You have improved. You taught me, I said. I showed you procedures, Vethric said. You did the rest. That's still teaching, I said. A pause, perhaps, Vethric said. On the 5th day of the deployment, something happened that had nothing to do with engineering. There was a joint crew meeting. The Varanthos and 2 coalition vessels, the ISS Corellian and a smaller frigate, meeting to synchronize patrol schedules and share intelligence about movement in the disputed sectors. The meeting was hosted aboard the Corellian, which meant a shuttle transit across, which meant Sergeant Colton and I were going over as the Varanthos' non-Drethari liaisons. Vethric came too. As senior engineering officer, it was expected at the technical coordination portion of the meeting. The Corellian was a human-majority vessel. Its crew was about 70% coalition humans, 30% Ivalan and a few other species. Walking aboard from the shuttle felt like stepping back into a different atmosphere, literally. The air was human-standard warm, the lighting was full spectrum, the corridors were straight. After 22 days plus 5 on the Varanthos, it was disorienting in a way I hadn't expected, like a reversal of what I'd felt walking aboard the Varanthos in the first place. Colton took a deep breath and said, "God, that smells right." I took a breath and realized I didn't feel quite what Colton felt. The air smelled right, yes. The temperature was right, the lighting was right. But something felt not wrong exactly, just different from what had become familiar. The meeting ran for about 3 hours. Technical coordination in the afternoon, operational briefings in the evening. During a break, I was in one of the Corellians' common rooms with a cup of actual coffee, real coffee, not the replicator approximation the Varanthos produced, and one of the Corellians' engineering officers, a Lieutenant Pemba, came to talk to me. She was maybe 5 years older than me, sharp-eyed, clearly curious. She'd heard I was the mechanic assigned to the Varanthos. "How is it," she asked, "actually living over there?" "Different," I said. "Interesting." She raised an eyebrow. "The Drethari don't exactly have a reputation for being easy to work with." I thought about Vethric's first and only compliment, "You looked," and the bracket geometry error it had caught before it became my mistake, and the 19 minutes of crisis in the propulsion bay, and the quiet conversation in the dark. "It depends what you mean by easy," I said. Pemba looked at me like she was waiting for more. "They're rigorous," I said. "They expect precision. They don't explain things in the human order, they go application first, which takes adjustment. The social protocols are different enough that you'll step on things you don't know are there." I paused. "But if you pay attention, and you're willing to be wrong and learn from it, and you ask the right questions," I thought about Vethric's phrase. "The ones that assume the system is still being understood, they're the best engineers I've ever worked beside." Pemba was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sound like you mean that." "I do," I said. "What's your assignment again?" "Mechanic." "Grade 7, Mechanical Systems." She looked at me. "How long have you been aboard?" 27 days. Another look, and you're already calibrating Drethari drive systems on your own. "With training," I said. "A lot of training." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I've been trying to get an extended Drethari vessel deployment for 3 years. The technical exposure alone." "I know," I said, "I know." When we returned to the Varanthos that evening, I found Vethric in the cabin, unusual. It was normally still in the propulsion bay at that hour, sitting at the desk with no active displays, which was even more unusual. Vethric with no active displays was like seeing a river with no current. Technically possible, clearly a state that meant something. "How was the coordination meeting?" I said, setting down my kit. "Adequate," Vethric said, which from the Varanthos' administration meeting that generated 17 pages of detailed cross-vessel protocol probably meant it had been inefficient. The Coalition technical officers had not reviewed the patrol zone atmospheric readings before arriving. The briefing time was extended significantly. "Yeah, I noticed the briefing's running long." I sat on the cot. "You've been here a while." "Yes. Working. Thinking," Vethric said, which from a Drethari senior engineer was a remarkably candid admission. I didn't press it, but I didn't leave it alone either, because 27 days had taught me when Vethric wanted a question asked. "About anything you want to share?" I asked. Vethric was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I submitted a report to the Varanthos command this morning about your performance during the gradient anomaly." I waited. "The report recommended your work for formal citation under Drethari Technical Merit Protocol," Vethric said. "The equivalent, in Coalition terms, of a commendation." I stared at it. "Vethric." "The recommendation was accepted," it said. "You will receive the formal notification through Coalition channels. I believed you should know its origin." I sat with that for a moment. A Drethari engineer writing a formal commendation for a human mechanic, filing it under Drethari protocol, which meant it would go into both the Drethari Collective's records and the Coalition's. A thing that, as far as I later discovered when I thought to check, had happened fewer than 40 times in the 30 years since the Coalition Drethari Engineering Exchange program began. "Thank you," I said. "It is an accurate report," Vethric said. "I know," I said. "Thank you anyway." And this time, Vethric didn't say it is not a compliment. It just looked at me for a moment, that compound-focused gaze, the one I knew now to mean something specific, something between precision and presence, and then turned back to the empty desk and began, slowly, to pull up a new display. Epilogue: What I Brought Home. We returned to Callisto Station 54 days after departure. I walked off the boarding ramp with my kit bag on my shoulder and my thermos in my hand, same as when I'd left, and the docking bay was loud and bright and straight-lined and smelled of human engineering and recycled Coalition standard air. And for a moment the sheer normality of it made me stop and just stand there. Sergeant Colton behind me stopped too. "You ever going to see them again?" he asked. Not them, he meant Vethric specifically, and he knew I knew that. "The deployment's over," I said. "The Varanthos has its own mission rotation." "That's not what I asked." I looked back at the Varanthos, still in the docking bay. It was as enormous as it had been when I first saw it, still with that grown quality, still beautiful in the way that made you slightly uncomfortable. The boarding ramp was still extended, and at the top of it, barely visible at the bay's distance, was a Drethari figure in a blue engineer's sash. Standing perfectly still. Not waving, Drethari don't wave, not gesturing, just present, aware. The way Vethric was always aware, fully without performance. I raised a hand. After a moment, Vethric's mid-hand rose, briefly, just enough to be seen. I turned and walked with Colton into the station. Chief Marvella Huang was waiting for me in her office 2 days later. On her desk was the formal Drethari Technical Merit Commendation, a physical document, rare enough to be remarkable, written in Drethari script with the Coalition translation alongside it, and a personnel file update that had come through from the Varanthos assignment. "Osai," she said. "Chief," I said. She looked at the document. "This is the 4th time in 23 years I've seen one of these issued to a Coalition crew member." "I heard it's uncommon," I said. "It's more than uncommon," she looked at me. "Vethriken Solith has a," she paused, searching for the word, "a reputation in Drethari engineering circles, not for being difficult exactly, for having extremely high standards, for not softening its assessments of people's work." "I know," I said. "And it wrote you a commendation." "I helped stabilize the drive system during a gradient anomaly," I said. "We both did. The report is accurate." Marvella studied me for a long moment. "What else happened over there, Os?" I thought about it. The 27 days of learning Drethari drive systems in the application-first method, with an engineer who didn't explain things in the human order and whose idea of praise was adequate. The night in the dark when we talked about why we'd each chosen what we'd chosen. The 3 inches of extra workspace. The way you looked had meant more than any formal compliment. "I learned how to work with someone very different from me," I said. "And how to, I don't know. How to recognize that different ways of being excellent aren't lesser ways. They're just different." Marvella was quiet. "I also learned that my load distribution calculations need work," I said. "Specifically the secondary stress coefficient. I've been using the wrong material constant." She smiled a little. "Grade 7 to grade 9, she said, and slid the personnel file update across the desk. "Effective immediately, and there's a request from the Varanthos command. They're asking the Coalition Engineering Division if you'd be willing to serve as a formal exchange engineer on the next deployment. 6 months, full Drethari technical access." I looked at the personnel file update. Then I looked at the commendation. Then I looked at Marvella. "When do they depart?" I asked. I went back. Of course I went back. Not because of the grade 9 pay, though that helped. Not because of the technical access, though that was extraordinary. Not because of the resume value of being one of the Coalition's few officially qualified Drethari drive engineers, though that has, in the years since, turned out to matter enormously. I went back because I had figured something out, in 54 days aboard the GCS Varanthos, that I couldn't have figured out any other way. That the universe is full of minds working on the same problems from completely different directions. That the space between those directions, the adjustment, the friction, the necessary awkwardness of 2 very different beings occupying the same space and trying to understand each other, is not an obstacle to engineering. It is engineering, the hardest version, the most important kind. That you looked from the right person in the right moment is worth more than 100 easy compliments. That 3 inches of cleared workspace can mean everything. I was on the Varanthos' second deployment when Vethric did something I had not seen it do before. We were in the propulsion bay, mid-transit, running a routine check. And Vethric at the primary monitoring station stopped mid-task, turned to face me and said, "Engineer Osai." "Yes. I have been reconsidering the bracket geometry modification you proposed in the Veth gathering on the first deployment." I looked up from the coupling array I was checking, the one with the wrong material constant. "With the corrected material constant," Vethric said. "The recalculation," it turned the display toward me, "yields a stress distribution improvement of approximately 9% across the mounting array." I looked at the schematic, at the revised numbers. 9% is significant, I said. "Yes," Vethric said. "I submitted the proposal to Drethari Engineering Standards this morning. It has been accepted for review." A pause. "Your name is on the proposal." I looked at it. "Both our names," Vethric said, clarifying with the slight precision of someone who wants to be accurate. "The modification was your idea. The corrected calculation was completed in collaboration." I stood there in the propulsion bay of the GCS Varanthos, in the deep blue light, with the ship humming around me and the Veth crossing gradient steady and clean in the readings. And I thought about a Thursday afternoon when Marvella Huang asked if I wanted a deployment, and I said yes before she finished the sentence. "Thank you," I said. "It is accurate attribution," Vethric said. And I have replayed this moment many times since, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so precisely the opposite of dramatic, so exactly itself, it added. "You asked the correct question. The one that assumed the system was still being understood." I smiled. Vethric, who cannot smile in the human way, did something with the set of its compound eyes and the alignment of its shoulder plating that I had learned, by then, to read fluently.